Okay, thank you. I'd like to give a little bit of an introduction to the Economic Forum. First of all, thank you all for being here. Some of you have been here since morning, and I see a lot of new faces now in the afternoon sessions, and particularly for this particular session here, which is with all the chambers of commerce. The Indonesia Economic Forum is in its 9th year. We used to be a conference like you would normally expect in a large hotel like Shangri-La or one of the others. And we would have typically from 700 to 1,200 participants who would come in and listen to our speakers. That was the old model. During COVID, we were forced to relook at how we did conferences. And in 2020 and 2021, we had 2 virtual events completely online on Zoom, which taught us a lot of new things about how we could expand our audience, primarily because we are an English language platform, and our job is to give insights that we know about Indonesia, which is gathered from people like you, experts and thought leaders, and be able to tell that story to the rest of the world. But we never realized that we could only tell it at 1,000 at a time. But with digital, we have an audience of more than 10,000 people now across 45 countries. So that's the new Economic Forum. Our voice, or the collective voice of the community, is being able to be amplified to reach out to a much larger audience than we could ever do. So the format you see today is actually an even bigger and better improvement on the typical, even the digital conferences. And I'll tell you why. It's because we have a very close, cozy environment here, and we are lucky that we have the Habibie and Ainun Library. This is Pa B.J. Habibie's initiative to build this place. It was meant to be a place for thought leaders to gather. A lot of historical events have taken place in this very room. And we are privileged that Ilham Habibie, who's on our board of governors, has allowed us that this can be the new home of the Indonesia Economic Forum. And the ability to have great speakers with a lot of wide experience in a room with other co-speakers. That's our format. So this is a live studio. And speakers and observers are invited to come here, and our audience is invited to join online. And because recognizing the time zone difference between the US and Europe, which cannot join typically live events here, we record everything and put it on our YouTube channel and our website channel. And over the next 30 days, we promote each session individually in a different way to reach that particular audience. So as an example, in the morning we had a session with SMU on talent management. That would be a session we would promote to all the universities across the world. To the learning communities across the world. This particular session that we're doing with the Chambers of Commerce, we would be promoting through the Chambers of Commerce, who are our partners, to their respective business communities around the world. We're also looking at going to higher education institutions and promoting it to students who are doing their doctorate or their postgraduate degrees, Asian studies across the world. Every university has an Asian studies. So the faculty there. So it's a new way of promoting the Indonesian narrative. And this would be the first year. So I call it the 2.0 of IEF. This is what we're starting now. We hope that over the year, since we have this venue, we are planning 50 such events next year. This is 8 sessions in 2 days. But we would do 1 session at a time every week. And we would partner with the different organizations. So we are actually using Gotong Royong concept of working with partners to co-create content where there would be a certain amount of competency and insight available because of coming together with another organization. So every Chamber of Commerce who's here today, we would do 1 event with you with a topic that we can co-create, work together and come up with, which would address something that particular stakeholders of both organizations would be interested in listening to. So a busy 2023 is planned. I'd like to now welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us. We have a great speaker among us, Pa Tom Lembong. And I say this with great pride because Pa Tom has been part of the Economic Forum for many years. In fact, I was talking to Shoeb that as long as back as he was in the chairman of BKPM, Minister of Trade, in all the capacities that he has been in the last, I think, 7, 8 years, he has always joined us, has been one of our recognized speakers, and you would know that the minute you hear him speak. He has the most recognizable voice in Indonesia, and I would say his sessions have been among the most popular in all the sessions that we've held. So thank you very much, Tom, and if you don't mind, I'd like to invite you on stage, because we have a presentation. But Tom always puts together fantastic presentations. And when his team asked me that should he just speak or should he present a few slides, I said absolutely he has to present a few slides because he makes some of the best slides as well. But Tom is actually involved in a lot of things. You would see a lot more of Tom in the next few years. He has a business role. He in fact has a prominent role in the upcoming elections. He's running the campaign for part of the campaign of Anis. He's part of the team. There's a lot of issues that come up when you are actually involved in an election year, because it brings up the core issues that affect the economy and the business environment. Immediately comes to mind, right? That would be something that's a compelling discussion to have. So we would have Tom. I would be moderating the session. We have, in fact, today here other trigger speakers for this. We have Neumann from Amcham. Just make out where you are. Okay, great. We have Poonam from IIBF. We have Connie. I think Connie, yes, she's here. Shoeb from Singcham, he's here as well. If I miss somebody, please let me know, because we're supposed to have somebody from Econet. But I think Yan was not able to make it on time. He may join us a bit later. So the format for this session, and we've had different formats. We had a panel discussion, we had a roundtable, we had fireside chat, we've done different kinds of formats. That's the beauty of having a studio here. So we're going to start with Tom giving us a presentation and some of the key things he's prepared, with a little bit of a fireside chat after that, and I would engage all of you into a discussion, into a roundtable format. So all the speakers from the Chambers of Commerce would be able to present their view on the topic today, which is the impact of G20 and B20 on global business, on international business. What exactly, how do you see your communities affected? Are they impressed? Are they demotivated? Are they like looking forward? All of these other issues that we want to talk about. And then we open it up for all the other participants here, because we have leaders from business, academia, legal experts also in the room who would be able to contribute to the conversation. Okay, so we get started right away. Thank you, Tom. I'll take my seat here, and over to you, and welcome to IEF once again. Mike, would you,
Thank you, Pak Sachin, and Pak Shoeb, and all of you, so many old friends. Allow me to not mention each of you one by one. But it's great to be back at the IEF in this new version 2.0 hybrid format. And actually, I was just telling Sachin during the coffee break, my understanding is that the World Economic Forum is not intending to bring back the regional summits. Yeah, so, of course, the annual summit in Davos is a flagship event and will continue. But what many of us used to know as like the Southeast Asia WEF, or the ASEAN WEF, or the India WEF, the Middle East WEF, the Africa WEF, which I've attended in Tanzania. I went to the Middle East one in Sharm el-Sheikh once. But apparently these regional summits are not coming back. Yeah, so I think IEF has an opportunity here to fill a vacuum. And all of you from the multinational companies, whatever budget you had for the regional WEFs, you can now spend on IEF so comfortably. So thank you for inviting me to participate. It's always such a pleasure for me. So G20 and ASEAN, right? So G20, we just handed over to India, the chairmanship, and we're about to assume the chairmanship of ASEAN for next year. So let's get right to it. Next slide. So I think it's fair to say that G20 was a success, right? Like, there's definitely a big feel-good factor. There's definitely, you know, a positive mood radiating out from G20 and B20, right? I would say that everybody went into the summit with quite low expectations, right? Like so much has been going wrong this year around the world, from Ukraine invasion to surprises on inflation, leading to the most rapid increases in benchmark interest rates in 20 years, right? Stock markets are down 20%, technology shares are down 50 to 60%. Even more surprisingly for me, investment grade bond market was down 35%. So single A rated, like triple B rated, like high grade corporate bonds, through September, I would say, through September this year, we're down like 35%. So I think the world was in a fair bit of pain. And of course, there's a lot of anxiety from the Communist Party Congress in Beijing, right? There's a lot of anxiety after Nancy Pelosi's unfortunate visit to Taiwan, right? And so I think, you know, when President Biden and President Xi came out of that meeting, you know, 3-hour meeting with such a constructive tone from both sides, I think you'd sort of hear the sigh of relief, you know, heard around the world, right? Like everyone's like, ah, right? And I think that was probably the highlight of it all, right? More so than, you know, any issues like Ukraine, you know, or I think the Joseph Biden, Xi Jinping summit sort of overshadowed everything, right? But it helped give this sort of positive mood, right, to the entirety of the G20 in Bali, including B20. But as we know, there was also everything from Urban 20 to think tanks T20 to Women 20 to Y20, you know, Youth 20. So I think the $20 billion deal, which was led by the US and Japan, but hopefully will include a lot of G7 countries, right, to accelerate Indonesia's energy transition, I think is right to be celebrated. I think it's a meaningful step in the right direction. And I think nobody throws parties the way we throw parties, right? Like in Indonesia, we know how to enjoy life. Like we know how to throw a good party, right? So all the videos, all the imagery of the spectacular, you know, bamboo dome for the leaders' lunch, the spectacular, you know, dinner at the Garuda Wisnu Kencana Park. Like nobody knows how to throw parties the way we throw parties, right? So I think that was all extremely welcome during a year that's been extremely challenging. Now, if we go to the next slide, you know, at the private equity fund, which I co-founded, we often like to say, better lucky than smart, right? Of course, if you have a choice, it's best to be lucky and smart, right? But if you have to choose, I recommend you choose luck over smarts, right? And, you know, Australia is famous as like the lucky country, right? But I think we're pretty lucky. Like we're a pretty lucky country, right? We've got great people, great culture, great nature, good weather for the most part. And luckily for us, just in the 1 month, 6 weeks before the G20 summit, suddenly all the markets became more conducive. Yeah. So on this slide, at the top left, I put European natural gas prices, which, of course, for those of you with any connection to Europe, has been causing incredible pain and suffering, across continental Europe, spiking ever higher. But thanks to determined efforts by European governments, by the European Commission, to go all around the world hunting for gas, there was abundant stocks of natural gas, and as luck would have it, October turned out to be a very mild weather in Europe, right? So natural gas prices actually collapsed by 2/3 in just like 3 or 4 weeks, right? Giving huge relief to governments, to consumers, to industries, right? So that's natural gas. And then below that, on the bottom left, we put an index of agricultural prices, which skyrocketed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? But again, since sort of July, prices started cooling quite a bit. And what I can share with you is that there was determined efforts, including by the think tank in London that I'm on the board of, the IISS, the Institute for International Strategic Studies, to reopen traffic in the Black Sea. Yeah. So basically, the reason vegetable oil prices skyrocketed, the reason wheat prices skyrocketed, is because the Black Sea suddenly was closed down due to the war between Russia and Ukraine, right? And quite possibly that was part of President Putin's initial strategy, is to cause energy prices to skyrocket, cause food prices to skyrocket, fomenting discontent among all the democracies, so that all his enemies, prime ministers and presidents, would all get voted out of office like a year later, right? And again, I think extremely deft diplomacy by various parties led to the deal between Turkey, United Nations, Ukraine, Russia, and NATO to reopen the shipping lanes from the Black Sea and to guarantee safe passage, right? And that basically restored the flow of wheat, restored the flow of sunflower oil, right? And that's brought wheat prices back down, brought vegetable oil prices back down, and vegetable oil prices, wheat prices, corn prices are now back to pre-Ukraine levels, right? So again, big sigh of relief. So that was another positive solution, yeah. And I remember the CEO of my think tank, of the IISS, yeah, as they prefer to be called, Dr. John Chipman said, how can all of you, meaning Americans, NATO, talk about guaranteeing a free and open Indo-Pacific if you cannot even guarantee a free and open Black Sea, right? And that was, to me, the most striking comment that I think probably made a lot of heads of navies, heads of militaries, defense ministers hang their heads in shame, right? And move forward with a naval escort and a diplomatic solution that reopened the Black Sea to shipments of grains and agricultural products, and hopefully soon fertilizer as well. Yeah. Now, on the top right and the bottom right, a nod to capital markets. As I mentioned, share prices were down, bond prices were down, right? But again, for various reasons, during the month of like October, November, we had a big sort of relief rally right? So stock markets rallied, bond markets rallied, technology shares rallied, and then semiconductors, which have been trending down, also rallied, right? So the stage first was set for everyone to come to Bali feeling a lot better, feeling a lot, less anxious, feeling a bit of relief, right? And I think I have to give credit to President Biden and to President Xi Jinping, and having been in a position behind presidents, I really have to credit their teams, President Xi's team, President Biden's team, in essentially striking the iron while it's hot, right? Basically, fully capturing the momentum and hitting the ball out of the park, right? And that basically now, I think, is giving a very sort of hopeful momentum and hopeful atmosphere to global talks and even some positive momentum to the COP27 conference that was happening concurrently with G20 and APEC, right? So the COP conference in Egypt. I think now, without hopefully throwing cold water on the warm afterglow of the G20 party, which was a great party, right? Nevertheless, now let's come back to earth. Let's come back to reality, Next slide. I think what struck me a little bit about the whole year of G20, right? Because the summit, of course, is a culmination of many months of ministerial level meetings, right? There's health ministers meetings, there's tourism ministers meetings, there's transportation ministers meetings, there's finance ministers meetings, of course, throughout the year, right? And I think it's very evident that our strategy on G20 and the whole program was to maximize Indonesia promotion, right? I think undoubtedly it was a massive promotional campaign to promote Indonesia to the world, right? And I would say it's undeniable that that strategy succeeded. I would say that the international media coverage from Bloomberg to Financial Times to, you name it, Wall Street Journal, I think giving a lot of credit to President Jokowi and our government and the business elites for, putting Indonesia on the map, right? So Indonesia's profile is enhanced like never before. However, what surprised me a little bit is that, I guess understandably, when you focus so much on promotion, there's not much space left for substance. Yeah, so not trying to be snide or anything, but this is just the reality that there's only 24 hours in a day, right? There's only 7 days in a week, and how you budget your time, how you budget your attention and resources, necessarily involves trade-offs, right? And if there's so much emphasis on promotion and hosting and the atmospherics, right? It crowds out a lot of the more substantive discussion. So just looking at the 4 major global challenges that I think have been stalking the world, and I think will continue to stalk the world into next year. The inflation challenge, right? The financial distress, like basically tightening financial conditions, particularly in the emerging markets. And then the continuing bursting of the technology bubble, right? And I think it so happens to be last week, Indonesian media is filled with stories of employee layoffs, by the technology companies ranging from Gojek to Ruangguru to, frankly, even Indosat and the like. And then the climate crisis remains, right? So I was a little bit surprised that there wasn't more focus on, short-term solutions, frankly, immediate solutions to these issues. Yeah. Of course, presumably when the government and all of us kind of put together this agenda last year, we were heavily flavored by the pandemic, right? So a lot of focus on healthcare and global health infrastructure and the like, right? Maybe we failed a little bit to be sufficiently forward-looking because as the G20 summit approached, the pandemic was fast receding around the world, and actually new challenges had taken the place of the pandemic, and maybe we were not as prepared for these new challenges as we were for the previous challenge, right? We're still talking about the healthcare infrastructure, the global health fund, and the like, when arguably new issues have overtaken the pandemic as kind of the new threats on the block. So again, I have to emphasize, in no way do I mean to belittle the, for example, $20 billion, just energy transition partnership deal that was announced, but that's going to take years. It's going to take many, many years. And actually, before us, there was the same deal, $7.5 billion, if I remember correctly, with South Africa, about a year earlier. And that's been a struggle, right? That's been a real struggle to operationalize it, if you will, from the initial concept. So that probably gives us an indication that it's not going to be easy to operationalize this $20 billion deal. It makes for a great headline, right? But the question we need to be aware of is, like, 2 years from now, where will that deal be? Right? Like, what are the prospects for that 2 years from now? And even, at a multilateral timescale, 2 years is like lightning speed. Yeah? It took us 4 years, start to finish, just to negotiate a trade agreement with Australia, right? So negotiating this kind of a monumental deal, whether it can be done in 2 years, question mark, right? And, I think we need to start managing expectations here. What can be expected within a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year time frame on this $20 billion deal. So in the meantime, I was quite reassured in a way by Ibu Shinta Kamlani's comments in the panel just before us, when she used phrases like, a perfect storm is coming next year, right? And I was very reassured actually by her comments that, look, just had a meeting with the Association of Footwear Manufacturers and orders are down 40%. For that industry, it's like getting ready to do massive layoffs, right? But again, this is, as you know, Sachin and Shoeb, the risk of inviting me. I'm like the party pooper in chief, right? Like, a pretty hawkish, hard money guy, right? So I was very amused when somebody in the session before asked me, should we print money, Pak Tom? I'm not a soft money guy. I'm a hard money guy. Like, I believe in strong fundamentals and tight money and discipline, right? I believe in monetary discipline. I believe in fiscal discipline and operational discipline. I think it merits discussion whether we've spent so much time promoting ourselves to the world that we lost time that we could have used to immediately formulate solutions for this year and next year, right? So, when the buzz wears off, will we have a hangover, right? And how will all this feel middle of next year, right? When possibly the energy crisis gets worse, the food crisis gets worse, right? And the market is shocked and dismayed that, oh my God, like the central banks have not yet conquered inflation and interest rates are still going up. Oh, and by the way, apologies if this is a bit technical, right? On monetary side, interest rates are only half the story. In fact, they might only be 1/3 of the story, right? The other part is the money printing, right? Or the opposite of it, right? So basically during the pandemic and then, 12 years prior after the Lehman crisis, Federal Reserve, printed lots and lots of money, right? Basically flooding the world with cash, right? By doing what's called quantitative easing, right? By buying the bonds, right? Now they're going into reverse. They're selling the bonds. They're unloading trillions and trillions of dollars of bonds that they purchased during the Lehman crisis of 2008, that they purchased during the pandemic. Now they're unloading. The Fed is now unloading $100 billion per month of treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities, right? And the European Central Bank will follow suit soon. So basically, this was sort of the second hit to liquidity. One is, rapidly rising interest rates. The other one is the quantitative tightening, right? So we had massive quantitative easing during the pandemic. Now, comes the aftermath is, the withdrawal symptoms to the world economy as the Federal Reserve, the ECB, others, potentially emerging market bonds, emerging market central banks like Indonesia might have to go into reverse and take back all this cash, return the bonds to the market, right? Next slide is just an illustration of the financial distress in our bond markets that's already happening now, right? So it probably started last year with the bonds of the Chinese property developers crashing, right? And they started crashing and continued crashing and continued crashing and continued crashing, right? First quarter, second quarter, third quarter of this year, right? All the bonds of the major real estate developers from China kept going down and down and down and down, right? And then eventually the next domino fell. A property developer in Korea, apparently the developer of Legoland Korea, right, defaulted or had payment difficulties, and that caused a lot of property and real estate bonds in Korea to crash, right? And it took less time for the next domino to fall, which is that Indonesian property developers' bonds are crashing, right? And here I put in no particular order or for no, it's just a sample, a random sample. And by the way, Pak Darmono was here earlier, and I personally apologized to him to put his company here. I said, are you leaving now, Pak Darmono, or are you going to stick around for the next session? Exactly, perfect timing. He left, so I said, I want to apologize to you, because I showed him this slide, right? Like, Pak Darmono, I put your company here as an example of financial distress. And I said, no, not intending any disrespect. This is just a reflection of financial market conditions, right? In no way do I mean this as a commentary on the management of the property companies, but this is just the cyclical reality of rapidly evaporating liquidity in the financial markets, right? So as you can see here, Agung Podomoro's bonds are trading at like 40 cents on the dollar. Actually, looking at this chart here, Jababeka bonds seem to be recovering. They went as low as 50 cents on the dollar, and are now probably back to like 60, 65 cents. But I think this story will still continue to play itself out well into 2023. I think there'll be more and more financial distress, and what are we going to do about it? And I look forward to discussing in this panel, having a interactive discussion on what potentially, can be done, or what we should, be doing now, in the aftermath of G20, when, we've got these issues rapidly coming down the pike. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Patom. In fact, you brought upon some very interesting starting points for a discussion here, because you mentioned the after party. Do you have an afterglow or do you have a hangover? But I think the danger is in patting yourselves on the back and not seeing the tiger at the door. And this is precisely why we love having you here, because you can bell the cat. It's very important for us to take these issues head on, because if you have discussed it, you can do something about it. And that's the whole idea, that we want actionable insights at the Economic Forum to be at the center stage of how we can start looking at some of these hard issues. And I'm very happy that we have a great group of people in the room who would be able to, create an interaction here. Rather than me asking Patom some questions, I do have some questions here myself. I'd like to actually bring it on to the trigger speakers that we have here. Maybe I'll start going in an order. Maybe Lynn, if you don't mind, Lynn, I'd like to ask you to kick off this with some specific insights or some questions to Patom, or maybe some comments, because Lynn represents the American Chamber of Commerce, and they have been very active in addressing some of these kind of issues, and there is a channel here to feed back that kind of information to the companies and the organizations that are part of the Amcham. So Lynn, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Sachin. Always good to hear Tom's thoughts. I think we talked privately about some of these issues not too long ago, before the B20, G20 started. We were there. The Amcham had a side event at the B20, and we were involved in a lot of American companies. Of course, were there at the B20 events. I think I agree with Tom. Overall, it was a hell of a party. I mean, I was sitting in the room at one of the plenary sessions, and there was this incredible stage show. I don't know who exactly was the choreographer, but these women in the Balinese dresses and the dancing, and then suddenly I realized, wait a minute, they're doing this to rock and roll. They updated all that kind of gamelan thing, and they kind of updated it all into something quite spectacular. So I think this speaks to some of the aspirations of people like Santiago Uno, who wonder, what's with these Koreans? What about us? There's so many of us. Well, when's the Indonesian wave coming? The Koreans have had such an impact with that. So I think there was a lot of this Indonesia on display going on, and for the most part, it felt good, I think, to be a part of it. What concerns me, though, and before I came, I was looking at some of the coverage of the G20 aftermath, the takeaways, and they're the ones that Tom listed. What concerned, I'll talk a little bit about how I think American business reacts to all this, but the other thing that kind of concerns me a bit about this, it was so much good time, such a good feeling. That's what the president wanted. The takeaway was spur investment. This was what have a good show. I think that's really what the president was after. That you didn't get a sense, at least on the B20 side of things, of the urgency that I think we should feel about climate. There was an Oceans 20 event going on and some discussions taking place, but there wasn't any sense of urgency about climate. Okay, we got the $20 billion. We've gotten similar projects in various other places. It's not going to solve the climate crisis. I mean, we're not going to suddenly have a bunch of coal plants replaced by solar in Indonesia. It's just not going to happen. And I'm focusing on climate because I think it's deeply, deeply worrying for Indonesia and for the future of Indonesia if we don't tackle this. There also was, of course, a lot of talk on various panels about the city in the sky, Nusantara, which now I understand is going to be bidding. A city that doesn't exist is going to bid to host the Olympics in 2036. This is kind of the triumph of vaporware in a big way. You know, I mean, I understand the president's aspirations to build Nusantara. You can talk to urban planners who will say it's absolutely the best thing to do, and you can talk to urban planners who say, "Oh my goodness, then don't do this. This is too big a pill to swallow." Especially in terms of the financing and all the dislocation that could come about. But regardless, there's a lot of, again, optimistic talk about something that hasn't happened. And that concerns me. I really think that not only Indonesia, which is doing reasonably well, but I think the whole world needs to roll its sleeves up and get to work on some of this stuff and not tell us how good everything is going to be. Because personally, I don't think it's going to be that good, you know, just in my own view. But it's one of the things that Indonesia is often marked by more optimism than the situation might realistically justify. And as we all know, and some of us have seen this at work in a company we all worked in. Sachin, Shoeb and I once worked in the same company for a while. It's not uncommon to have amazing targets. We're going to accomplish this. We're going to take over the world. We're going to be bigger than big. And everybody in the company pretty soon is saying, yeah, wait until that happens. That'll be great. Well, what if it doesn't happen? Well, we just won't mention it again, right? So there was some of that around some of the events that I participated in or went to at the B20. It's kind of a unrealistic sense of things, and people sort of cheering that on. Now that said, turning the G20 into a giant trade show was kind of odd, but it was certainly fun. But again, sometimes people lose sight of the fact that, you know, everybody comes to us and says, well, what are the American companies going to do? We had this great G20. You don't make investment decisions based on G20. You make investment decisions based on policy, the quality of the workforce, the state of the healthcare adds into that, corruption is part of it, governance is part of it. There's all kinds of things that go into making the kind of investment decisions that, say, Tesla seems to be pondering, despite the many times that it's been announced by various people that Tesla's coming. I checked again, not yet, boom, masih di process, you know, just hasn't happened yet. So Tesla is obviously going through their own process of due diligence. Now that said, if I look at the sectors that we represent, there's some buoyancy of feeling in the energy sector among some of the American companies. You notice that Chevron signed some sort of an MOU down in Bali. I think the sense I get from talking to some of the big energy companies is that they feel like Indonesia maybe has had enough of throwing the oil companies out of the country, and is starting to realize that let's keep what we've got and let's build on it, because the technology that the oil companies, the energy companies have, that much of which is applicable to climate transition, that's really important. Freeport seems to be going fine. They're happy. They seem to be pursuing an extension. The JV deal that they're operating under seems to be okay. There's no drama there. The sectors that feel most vibrant to me after the B20, before the B20, you know, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, medical technology, healthcare, all the big American players want to be in Indonesia in a bigger way. And the government will have to decide how to handle that, because they're not very pleased with being told by the government, well, you have to make 80% of your pills in Indonesia or you can't be here. That they don't respond well to those kind of threats, you know, the local content threats, but they do want to be in Indonesia. It's a great market, and you could see a real boom in pharmaceutical, med tech, this kind of thing. The ICT sector continues to be very ebullient. These layoffs, however, are not just Indonesia. They're also in Singapore and then the US and all over the place. So there is a real belt tightening taking place among those companies, but I still expect to see more expansion in Indonesia. Companies like Meta and Apple and others have been pretty happy here. They've done well in Indonesia, and I expect that will continue. And you will continue to have a desire to expand. I think a lot of our companies are wanting to expand. Kraft Heinz is opening a new factory on Monday out in Karawang. There's a lot of plans for expansion and a lot of desire for expansion. So I think at the moment, Indonesia is very well poised, and the feeling among my members is reasonably positive. We have a little issue with the minimum wage at the moment. I gather Shinta talked about that earlier. And we have a continuing issue for American companies that is always mentioned but never solved, and that's education and the quality of the workforce. You know, if you hire a lot of people in Indonesia, especially outside of Jakarta, that means you're hiring them so that you can train them for 3 years and then have a workforce that you can really depend on. So one of the things we argue to the government is, you know, bring the big American companies in here. They'll set up an educational system for you, just like they have done in other sectors. And it's not to be arrogant or demeaning, but that's the reality. So those issues continue. Healthcare I could talk about all day. I don't want to get into it, but the issues are all there. They've gotten better. We're writing our annual investment report this week. We're finishing it. The overall tone is much more positive than it was in years past. The omnibus law has had a real effect. It's incomplete, but it's a real improvement in a lot of areas for American companies, and it's opened up possibilities for greater investment just simply because they took away the equity caps and allow you to control your own investment 100%. Just that one thing is generating a lot of investment because people want to run their own factories. So the more that we have that kind of approach, I think the better it will be. And all of this stuff was talked about on the sidelines of B20, G20, but the actual event itself, I don't think it tips anybody to say, oh, okay, I'll bring $1 billion to Indonesia now because I like the dancing. You know, that's not. It was nice, but that's not going to. Doesn't have an impact, a direct impact on investment decisions, as far as I know. So it's just a few random comments.
Okay. Thank you, Lim. And we've managed to bell a few more cats. So actually, you know, Tom.
Don't tell anybody I said all these terrible things. I'm going to get in trouble.
So, you know, Tom, you've been chairman of the BKPF, and I think some of these issues are very well within your, scope of experience. Would you like to just comment on that? How do you see this playing out?
Well, first, the issues that Lin outlined are very familiar to me, of course, and I think, I cannot help but agree with, everything Lin sort of outlined. I think these are all very commonsensical. I think I would add to that we've been phenomenally lucky this year as a country, as Indonesia, right? Things have gone just right for us. Like the right commodity prices have gone up in our favor. And for example, believe it or not, fuel consumption has not yet rebounded to pre-pandemic levels, right? So the trade surplus from the booming commodity exports is coming at a time when our fuel imports have not yet rebounded, leading to our first current account surplus in 11 years, right? And that's what enabled our central bank to delay raising interest rates for so long without crashing the rupiah. It's because we're one of fewer and fewer countries around the world that's having current account surplus, right? And the currencies of current account surplus countries tends to strengthen, right? Now, Ibu Sri Mulyani has already publicly commented that she certainly does not expect this commodity windfall to continue into next year, right? And as the charts that I put up earlier indicate, like a lot of commodity prices already back down, right, to pre-Ukraine levels, and more commodity prices are surrendering to monetary policy, like the rising interest rates and quantitative tightening are finally puncturing a lot of the commodity momentum. Like, it's quite astonishing to me that we're in the middle of an energy crisis and crude oil prices keep going down, right? Unfortunately, natural gas prices keep, even though they're down thanks to a mild October, I think the outlook is quite dire. And in other occasions, I've pointed out that 50 to 60% of all the chemical fertilizer in the world is made from natural gas, right? So palm oil, agriculture are very, very important in this country, right? So I think we need to be paying more attention to fertilizer prices, for example, and their linkage to natural gas prices. But back to Lynn's comment that FDI decisions are multi-year projects, right? I mean, they're long-term decisions, so you have to look at kind of a 3-year, 5-year, 7-year, and 10-year horizon, right? And you have to shape policy to make those calculations sustainable, right? So it's not only, we're the best performing stock market in Asia this year. Like, we're the second or third best performing currency among emerging market currencies this year. Any investor will say, well, I've got to put together a 3-year, 5-year, and 10-year projection for my boss. So what do I put into the 3-year, 5-year, and 10-year projection, right? So it's, I can't say, look at the rupiah today. Look at the current account surplus today, right? Like, investors will look at the long-term fundamentals, and I think, Lynn, you touched on a very important one, which is the labor force, right? The quality of the labor force, the skill level, the educational, literacy levels of our labor force. These are things which I feel have not gotten as much and enough attention, in the course of the past 12 to 18 months.
Thank you. Very well put, actually. And since you talked about gas prices, I was in Europe in September when it started getting very cold, and when I came back in October, it warmed up. So there you go. It's absolutely. So I think we should hear from Connie from Eurocham. She's representing Eurocham. And do your views of what's happening resonate with Lynn, or do you have a different perspective? Please, over to you, Connie.
I hope and like to be a little bit more positive. Yeah. I like the party, and I hope the party will continue for a bit longer. I think one of the things is I believe that there's been a lot of that positivity that you're seeing in the, for example, this year, other than been lucky, I also think that the infrastructure work that has been happening and been on the consumer side of things, I do see that outside Java, we genuinely see growth. And I think pretty good job in terms of inflation, holding it to where it is today relative to what everybody else is seeing, and pretty food sufficient. The part that I would like to raise, and Thomas, I'd like to hear your view, is also on healthcare. Because we know that one of the issues that Indonesia has always had is healthcare. Well, I remember discussing this with you as well. 1/3 of our children are still stunted. Half of pregnant women are actually anemic. And what the COVID and pandemic has done is actually slowed down some of these things. which healthcare and inclusive healthcare was a topic in G20. It wasn't getting the traction that you would think that you would get to solve the long-term health agenda of Indonesia. Education, I think I would give credit. Lots of great work been done, university curriculum. The Campus Merdeka, as Danone, we've been very active. We have 100 interns running around our office, and that I think credit to that, great job. But at the same time, if you think of the pandemic, and it's quite an extended pandemic for Indonesia, it's almost going into the third year. We're not in endemic. School is not exactly quite the same. I think there's a lot to catch up on. But back to the positive side, and something I'm quite interested to hear from you, political rallies and all that's going to happen is the build-up of 2024, and you're right in the mix of all that, right? How do you see that? Because would you see a lot of euphoria? The party on the political rallies happens in 2023, and then 2024, everybody would be looking at what's going to happen then.
Well, that's another party coming up. So, Tom, yeah.
That one's a real party and a longer party.
Yes, over to you, Tom.
So, let me. No worries. Let me address the healthcare question first. Yeah. So I think that's a perfect illustration or a perfect example of what I meant when I feel that things were surprisingly light on substance. Yeah. So I think there was this sort of $1.5 billion global healthcare fund raised, right? But beyond that, right? For example, climate change will have dramatic impacts on public health, right? Will have impacts on infectious diseases. Will have impacts on heat stroke and the like, right? We're still combating fundamental threats like antibiotic resistance, right? Like the world is still overusing antibiotics, particularly in livestock industries, right? And today, around the world, more people die from antibiotic-resistant infections than die from HIV/AIDS, right? In fact, by now, the number may have overtaken HIV plus malaria combined, right? So more and more people around the world, it's like in policy circles called a silent pandemic. Yeah? It's a silent epidemic of antibiotic resistance. Again, maybe I'm a bit biased here because just a few months ago, I had a very bad sinus infection. Doctor gave me Augmentin, didn't work. Came back 5 weeks later, and I said, wow, seems like you have a Augmentin-resistant infection, Pak Tom. So gave me a harsher antibiotic, and that barely worked, right? I do think healthcare is a really, really crucial, massively fundamental issue in this country and around the world. Of course, it's a massively varied issue because in the rich countries, you have issues of aging, right? And you have issues of chronic disease led by, still rising obesity, for example. In the poor or developing countries, it's childhood stunting, like you mentioned, Connie. Pregnant women, nutrition, and the like. So I think this segues a little bit to your second question on politics. Yeah, this is where the magic of democracy comes in. The electoral cycle automatically provides an opportunity for a reset, right? And in a healthy democracy, the pendulum will swing, from one side to the other, right? So I still feel that President Jokowi was the right choice in 2014 and was the right choice in 2019. I feel he was a great president for his time, right? So after 10 years of President Yudhoyono, like for the pendulum to swing towards this very business-minded, economy-focused, sort of action-oriented president was wonderful for the country, right? Just like President Yudhoyono was wonderful for the country when he came in, right? That was merely like 2 years after President Wahid was impeached, merely 2 years after the September 11 attacks in New York and Washington, right? And in my view, President Yudhoyono brought a kind of calm and gravitas and stability, right? And he just stabilized things, right? But I think 10 years of stability, we're itching for something more dynamic, right? And lo and behold, the electorate gives us President Jokowi, right? But now, we're heading into the home stretch of the 10-year era of President Jokowi, right? And I think it's precisely this kind of discussion that needs to happen right now, right? What's next? Like, where does the pendulum need to swing? And I would say, healthcare, education, environment, right? We need to shift more towards the quality of growth, not the quantity of growth, right? But unfortunately, on the political cycles and the magic of democracy, the party is usually during re-election. And yeah, I guess there was quite a bit of euphoria when President Jokowi and Vice President Kala came in 2014, because it was so fresh, it was so fun, it was so novel, it was so quirky and, filled with humor. Again, because of the challenges we face next year, right? Ibu Shinta Kamdani's perfect storm, right? The stretch into 2024 might not be so, so much partying, might not be so much, euphoria and celebration, and might actually be quite tough, yeah. And personally, I wouldn't be surprised if there'll be a very modest celebration, like victory celebration in 2024 because of the magnitude and the intractability of the challenges that we'll be facing at that time. Yeah. I was there in 2014 and couldn't help celebrate, right, our victory, but I was very, very aware that actually there was massive issues looming then, right? And you might remember that in President Jokowi's first month in office in 2014, he raised fuel prices by like 70%, right? And that basically bought him fiscal space for the next 7 years, right? So I was very much, surprise, in that hawkish, reformist, technocratic camp that urged him to bite the bullet, do it now, get it over with, rip the Band-Aid off, right? And it paid off for the next 7 years, right? Unfortunately, 7 years later, fuel subsidies are right back to where they were before, right? And so we've had sort of creeping regression, and that's eroded an enormous amount of fiscal space, right? And will leave us in a weaker position going into next year and the next couple of years, at least as far as the government's fiscal posture is concerned. Yeah. Even though, yes, this year we've been enormously lucky and we're performing extremely well this year.
Well, you make a good point, actually. The previous election, 2019, I think many of the issues that are in today's world were not even there in the election platform. Who predicted COVID? Predicted so many of the other problems that we are actually going through now. Whereas the coming election might actually be facing some real issues because we are already addressing those issues, and I think the politics of Indonesia is going to be centered around the kind of solutions that are being put forward. There's another aspect of people understanding these issues a lot more. So a lot of clarity and information would be really playing a critical role in the upcoming election. We may see a much more smarter election coming forward. Okay, great. I'm going to go to Shoeb. Shoeb, you are the president of Singcham. That's a position that you've been taken recently. And I think Singaporean business is much closer, actually well connected to Indonesia in many ways, which may not be so obvious. So what's the mood in the camp of the Singaporean companies, businesses, etc.?
Hi, thanks, Sachin. Unfortunately, I was not in Bali, so I did not party. So I neither have a hangover nor a warm buzz. But I think the mood in Singapore, among Singapore companies and investors, I would say is more bullish than bearish. They see good progress on a number of fronts where Singapore companies are really keen to invest in. One of them, of course, is in the energy transition, especially in EVs. There's a lot of interest in the EV market. But against that, there's also a concern that, they're being kind of elbowed out of the way by the Chinese. There's concern that Indonesia may be leaning too close to the Chinese at the expense of the other investors who are also very keen to come into this market. And on that point, also, in terms of coming elections, yes, where the pendulum will swing is important. I think the concern or top of mind worry among investors is really, will the trend continue? Will the commitment to these policies continue post-2024? Or is that going to be a huge change again? And so if you put in $1 today, is your dollar safe post-2024? Right? So I think that's a lot of concern given that, it's not just in Indonesia, but in democracies. New presidents come in with new agendas, new priorities. Will this continue? I think over the past 3-4 years, there's been a lot of focus on clean energy, where Singapore companies are also very keen to invest in solar. But then again, will this continue, right? So I think in education, there's a lot of interest in the education sector. And there, I guess the concern really is there are signs of opening up and the signs of wanting to engage, but then again, how solid is that? And is there real commitment, or will there be backsliding, really? And I think that's really one of the key concerns for Indonesia is, as we said, you take 3 steps forward and 2 steps backward, and then you're stuck, right? In between somewhere, and then you got to figure the things out. But I think generally, even beyond that, I think generally the view is that there is political stability. Just personally speaking, I just don't see a coup happening in Indonesia. It's just near impossible. So I think that's political stability. Their elections are good for the country. Like you said, it gives you an opportunity to reset, but it also gives you the foundation and stability. The other question, of course, is the same old issues of legal certainty. Our legal institutions stronger today than they were 8 years ago. Has there been legal reform? I think those are key issues for investors. Of course, the other institutions are also going to be important. Security is going to be important with an election coming. We saw what happened in the police a couple of months ago. Is that deeply embedded within the security forces? Is that competition and even corruption? Or is that just a one-off? That's what's not clear, right? So I think those are some of the key points. Thanks.
Thank you, Shoeb. Tom, you've had a lot of interaction with investors coming in from Singapore. Do you see, going on what Shoeb has been talking about, do you see this is that the role, or is that the viewpoint the Singaporean investors should be having about Indonesia, or do you see a different point of view there? Because it's different from, let's say, the American business or the European business. Singapore is right next door. It's a 1.5-hour flight, and there's a lot of opportunity for engagement. Is there an opportunity that needs to be explored?
Absolutely. And in fact, I would argue not just Singapore, but also Malaysia. Yeah, I really feel Malaysia has been a bit neglected. I was so happy to be back in Malaysia a few weeks ago for the first time in a few years. And I just realized, gosh, all the media coverage is on, Singapore's skyrocketing success. I read that in this year, there's like $300 billion capital inflow into Singapore, just this year, mostly from China, right? And I think Singapore is doing extremely well, which is beneficial for Indonesia and for the region. And then there's a lot of press on Indonesia during our G20 presidency, and with our unicorns and and all that, and nickel and Tesla, and I think Malaysia is undervalued and I would argue a screaming buy. And my pitch to everyone is that, look, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia are extremely complementary, right? Like we each occupy a very different rung in the development process. I mean, Singapore is one of the richest countries in the world, right? Malaysia is already middle income and going beyond middle income, and we're just coming up into middle income. So, synergy between the three would be a no-brainer. Yeah. And yes, undoubtedly, companies and multinationals who are closer to here, have a greater role or a different role to play compared to multinationals that are further away. But to your question, Shoeb, will there be policy continuity or will there be policy upheaval after 2024? My prediction is there'll be 70% policy continuity, no matter who wins. And I can say that, hand on heart, being, an enthusiastic member of Governor Anies's campaign team. Yeah. I don't think there's any intention on Governor Anies's part, at least, to politicize policies that are positive, right? If anything, we might urge going further, faster on things like climate policy, energy transition, right? Healthcare and education. But, for example, I spent a fair bit of my time trumpeting President Jokowi's success in cleaning up the Citarum River, which in my view is paradigm shifting. Yeah, like it really transformed the mindsets of the people around that river that this is actually possible, right? I mean, that river was dirty and polluted, for decades, but 2 years of determined effort, right, clean up the river and open the minds of the people along the river that this is actually possible, right, that a new way is possible. I also applaud President Jokowi's success, for example, with peatlands, like preventing the forest fires. I think re-flooding the peatlands, re-wetting the wetlands. We've now not had forest fires for a good 7 years to speak of, right? So, blessedly free from the choking haze that otherwise afflicts us every dry season, right? So I think there's been meaningful progress on that. So we're certainly not going to politicize that, right? Like, having said that, yes, there should be change. And we've touched on some of the things that we feel should get more attention. Education, healthcare, right? And Shoeb, you touched on a really critical issue, which is institutions. Yeah. So I think Nikkei Asia has been extremely astute. They interviewed President Jokowi extensively, and they interviewed Governor Anies extensively, and basically said, President Jokowi is a hardware guy, Governor Anies is a software guy, right? Nobody builds hardware like President Jokowi, right? And nobody is as passionate about software as Governor Anies. Institutions, judiciary, legality and law, education, mindset, culture, health, these are all the soft infrastructure of a society and an economy. And again, this could be a pendulum swing, during the 2024 electoral cycle, right? The other thing, okay, now let's push aside a bit of the dark clouds and bring a bit of sunshine and blue sky. There's positive and promising trends on reversing populism and demagogues around the world. Actually, I did not plan on putting that into my remarks today because I was saving this for Dino Jalal's flagship event on Saturday. But I might as well share it here to you as well, right? I think another reason why G20 summit felt so good is because Donald Trump suffered big defeats during the midterm elections in the US, right? So all the right-wing demagogue, election-denying, extremist candidates actually probably cost the Republicans control over Congress, right? So everybody breathed a huge sigh of relief over that. And a few weeks before that, President Ignacio Lula defeated President Bolsonaro, right? So Bolsonaro was kind of like another populist, spin-oriented, right, demagogue leader. Not to mention that the strongly populist, ideological Liz Truss, right, was swiftly deposed, first by the bond markets, and then by Rishi Sunak, who exemplifies a steadier hand, right? Like exemplifies a more technocratic or rational approach to things versus Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's extremely ideological approach to budget, fiscal policy, even monetary policy, right? So going into G20, we had a kind of a technocratic moment, if you will, right? Like, it's still early. President Lula will face tremendous challenges in Brazil, right? So he won't have an easy time. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will be facing tremendous challenges in the UK, right? But I'm actually kind of hopeful that maybe this is the beginning of a retreat of populism and demagoguery, right? And okay, we sort of had enough of the circus, right? We've had sort of enough of President Trump and Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and Bolsonaro and so on. And Sachin, I couldn't agree with you more. Actually, today when you mentioned it just now during the coffee break, it's probably the first time it's ringing bells in my head. I do think it's going to be a smarter election. I do think the voters are smarter. And this is the upside of social media that we rarely talk about. I think the dissemination of information in easily digestible chunks, in the 30-second videos, the 1-minute videos, disseminated by the World Economic Forum, by people like yourselves at the IEF, right? Like information, explanation, right? Podcasts. Yes, there's a lot of hoax out there. There's a lot of fake news and misinformation. But if I had to guess, maybe the hoax is a painful but minority 20-30%, and the positive information, the real facts, truths might actually be 70-80%, right? It's just that, look, if the water you're drinking is 10% poison, that's not good, right? We need it to be 1%. But it's not 60%, right? It's more like 20%, 10%. So yeah, I'm quite hopeful that maybe, where we're seeing a reversal of this trend towards, more and more sensationalist, like populist, outrage-driven, anger-driven, lies-driven. And of course, Singapore is a paragon of technocratic excellence, so I think this will be a more comfortable world for a place like Singapore. And a person like me, to be honest.
A very good point made. Smarter election and probably a cleaner election, because a lot of these hoaxes also backfire. And we've seen that happening everywhere. So there's a kind of karma, digital karma that comes in play. All right, so I want to now go over to Poonam. Poonam Sagar is here. She is the chairperson of the Indonesia-India Business Forum. And the reason I came to you last, Poonam, is mainly because G20's presidency is now moved to India. And I wanted to get a feel of where do you think Indian companies are looking at the G20 interaction with Indonesia, because I think that's more important. What happens in India is still to come, but what was the outcomes? President Modi was here, Prime Minister Modi was here. There was a lot of gathering of business persons around his visit, as well as at B20. What's the mood that you feel that's happening around the Indian businesses around G20, which happened here? Over to you, Poonam.
Thank you, Sachin. So now the party is moving to India. So
it's going to be a Bollywood party.
So, you know, Indonesia has always been a very attractive market for India. And not only today, but it has happening for 2 millennia. And people come from India to Indonesia, not only to trade, but also for various other, there's a cultural connect, there's lots of trade, and there's lots of, if you look at it currently, you can see that India is the back office for many tech companies. Look at Gojek. In fact, look at here, your company's back office is sitting right here. So, you know, look at that. Even we have another tech company which has now come to Indonesia. So there are so many tech companies that come to Indonesia from India. And so the 3 main pillars of the G20 was tech, digital transformation, healthcare, and energy. And we look at those 3 components only, and we see that there's such a huge way that we interact with each other. We have technology, which is everywhere. We see there are lots of startups coming to Indonesia from India. The digital back office that's happening in India. And when we look at healthcare, now, healthcare is something that I feel personally very strongly about, because India, during the pandemic, they were supplying the vaccine to the entire world. However, we could not take advantage of that largesse here in Indonesia. Secondly, there is a huge healthcare infrastructure in terms of resources, people available in India, but in Indonesia, we don't take advantage of that. And it has been going on for many, many years. This is not the first time it's happening. And the third one is energy. We see that from Indonesia, lots of coal is exported to India. And you know, so India, a lot of the energy in India is fulfilled by Indonesia. So these things are the 3 key pillars. But apart from that, India is burgeoning, it's growing, it's huge. And Indonesia, for some reason, we see a lot of businessmen and tradespeople coming from India to Indonesia, but the opposite is not true. India is the largest market for Indonesian palm oil. And you know, there are few scattered industries in India, like pulp and paper, like maybe Indorama has set up company. There were some other few companies. You would be surprised to know that you can buy Indomie in India, but it is through trade, and it is not because these companies have established themselves in India. So there are lots of opportunities for synergy, and one of the key things that keeps coming up repeatedly in every session that I go to is about connectivity. There are no direct flights to India. So even now, if you were to go for the party, you would need to change flights. So, you know, that is a major problem. And because it, like when Ranjini came, she said it took me the same amount of time as it would take her to go to the US. Although they are geographically, they're much closer, just 40 nautical miles close to each other. So those are just some issues, you know, connectivity is one. Secondly, I think it is also confidence. Education. Look at India, look at its educational progress in the sense that it has these large technical institutions, it has these large management institutions, and we are providing digital transformation to the entire globe. So that may be, in Indonesia, if we need to develop talent, we should look there. close to home. Instead of sending our students to the US or UK or Australia, India is much closer. So those are just some things that, they are staring at us right in our face, and not today, but for many years. But nothing has been done about it. And now with the G20 moving to India, I think these are some things that we should just stand up to and maybe take some hard decisions.
Thank you, Poonam. In fact, Tom, maybe this is a underdeveloped relationship, and I think if you could share some of your views on what is it that needs to be done, because this is something that's been talked about, but it doesn't move. So how do you feel that one can explore the viability of a good partnership?
So you can tell everyone that I'm an India fanatic. Seriously. So I was very active in President Jokowi's state visit to New Delhi in 2018, right? And I told all my colleagues in the cabinet, of course, especially the economic team, right? Even then, this was 2018, we have a huge trade deficit with China. We have a huge trade surplus with India, right? And one of the biggest imports from China for us is active pharmaceutical ingredients, right? So if we could switch our imports from China to India on active pharmaceutical ingredients, it would reduce our trade deficit with China, and it would reduce our trade surplus with India, and it would leave everybody better off, right? It would leave all three in a more balanced trade relationship. Sadly, it didn't work. Yeah, for various reasons that I won't get into now, that strategy didn't work. What did work in the end was when I persuaded Hyundai Motor Group, who had just completed several multi-billion-dollar factories in India, that if they choose West Java as their manufacturing hub for ASEAN, I would eliminate import duties on automotive imports from India to Indonesia. Yeah, and I think that was what clinched the deal, actually. They were blown away. It's like, whoa. The last thing they expected from me was to bring in India into the equation between Korea and Indonesia, right? But this is an example of highly optimizing global supply chains, right? By freeing trade between Korea, India, and Indonesia, at least on automotive, each factory site can specialize on what they do best, right? And that one works, I believe. I predict a boom in automotive component and automotive exports from India to Indonesia, as well as the other direction, yeah? So I believe we are seeing a very healthy development of the automotive supply chains between Korea, India, Indonesia, and I predict with the completion of the free trade agreement with Australia, eventually to Australia. Yeah, so Korea, Indonesia, India, Australia, right? That's progressing very, very nicely. So as an illustration of what needs to be done, right? What can you do to foster this this relationship? Let me try to add some unique value to this economic forum by now talking a little about geopolitics. Yeah, because when my good friend, IISS CEO, Dr. John Chipman, invited me to join the board of the IISS in London last spring, it was quite new for me. IISS was established after the Second World War and is focused on military, security, and geopolitics, right? At the time, my preoccupation was the China-US trade war, and Dr. Chipman wanted me to contribute in the fledgling sector called geoeconomics. Yeah, so geopolitics is an old science that's very established, but we have a new science called geoeconomics. Yeah. and this is something I've gotten deeper and deeper into with the invasion of Ukraine and the worries around now around China's potential invasion of Taiwan. Yeah. But there are so many geopolitical reasons for India and Indonesia to work closely together. Yeah. So even a year ago, in comments I made at various events like Lowy Institute, I think, and others, I said, you know, this is, I know what it is. I quoted the Lowy Institute. A researcher at the Lowy Institute in Sydney came up with this wonderful term called the middle power moment. Yeah? So India and Indonesia are, in geopolitical science, called middle powers, right? We're not superpowers, at least not yet, right? China, the US are the two superpowers. You know, we're still middle powers. Even Japan would be categorized alongside us as a middle power. And with the escalating tensions between the two superpowers, it becomes all the more critical that we have enhanced collaboration among the middle powers. Yeah? Now, India is the pillar in its region, in South Asia. Indonesia is the pillar in our region. And so it makes absolute sense for India and Indonesia to coordinate, to synchronize, to deepen and enhance our bilateral cooperation. Absolutely, no question about it. Thank you for pointing out the issue of connectivity. Well noted. You know, stay tuned. You know, that could show up somewhere in the policy 3 years from now, but, you know, sorry. Help us win first. Then we'll implement.
Tom's going to open an airline.
No, but if you think about it, right? Yeah. How can Singapore Airlines compete with Emirates? How can Singapore Airlines compete with Qatar Air? How can Qantas compete? By offering direct flights, right? So you can fly Singapore-London, right, using Qatar or Emirates very cheaply. But, you know, for those of us who are okay to pay a bit extra, you know, Singapore Airlines offers a direct flight, right? We can fly Singapore or Jakarta to New York very cheaply using Qatar, Emirates, Etihad, right? But for those of us who, you know, are willing to pay extra, we can take a direct flight, or at least used to. Jakarta, London, right? But that's the whole strategy of Qantas, right? I mean, that's Project Sunrise, yeah. Right? They're now going to roll out a fleet of planes that can do Sydney, New York direct, Sydney, London direct. You know, technology is happening that makes those things possible that was not possible 10 years ago, right? Again, you know, there'll always be, you know, Sydney, London via Doha. There'll always be Sydney, London via Singapore. There'll always be Sydney, London via Dubai. But there is, you know, that's what we should be offering as our value added or differentiator, right? Like if you're Garuda, say Jakarta, New Delhi direct, as opposed to via Singapore or elsewhere, right? Yeah. Like Bali, Mumbai direct. Yeah. So thank you.
Well, noted, and I think, you know, Poonam, these are the issues that you can take up in the IIBF, because there are issues which I think needs deeper understanding and addressing one by one, because the party happens, the song and the dance ends, but nothing moves. And that's something that needs to be explored in greater detail. I'm going to open this out to the floor. We still have a good 20 minutes for all of you who don't want to face the maddening traffic outside. After we are going to conclude in 20 minutes, and then we have a free flow of wine and beer and soft drinks outside, so that you can wait for your time to not be stuck in the traffic. And it's open till about 7, so you can be here as long as you like. So let's use the next 20 minutes with Tom to pick his brains, or maybe, you know, brainstorm some new concepts and ideas. I leave it to the floor. And does anybody would like to go first? Yeah, Manoj Nanwani here. Please, Manoj. Over.
Hi, Patom. My name is Manoj Nanwani. I just wanted to ask you if there is a possibility of, if you look at inflation that's happening now, a lot of the inflation that's happening is cost-push inflation, i.e. because of commodity prices rising. But a lot of these commodities, like you said, have actually fallen off in prices. I mean, US oil prices from $120 now at $80. Coal prices coming off, natural gas prices coming off. Is there a possibility that by next February, you might have a disinflation? Because if you calculate inflation, it's a year-on-year basis, and all this spiked up in March, April. So by April next year, you might have a disinflation, and there will probably a possibility of easing off on the interest rates hikes, or probably even an interest rate reduction. Not an easing of monetary policy, but a sort of a slowdown in interest rates. And then it might not lead to the crisis or the coming up of the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an excellent question. Goes to the heart of the challenges we're facing for next year. Yeah, monetary policy, interest rates, quantitative tightening, inflation. What you propose is entirely possible. It's not impossible. A slowdown in inflation, facilitating a slowdown in the rise of interest rates and quantitative tightening. Yeah. For my part, unfortunately, that's not what I'm forecasting. I'm sort of on the side of a bit more pessimistic on inflation for next year, and frankly, even for the next 3 to 5 years. I'm not sure I'm there yet with the school of thought that thinks that we've just had 40 years of disinflation and deflation, and it's now going to be followed by 30 years of inflation. I'm not sure I'm with that school of thought yet. Yeah, there's actually a surprisingly large school of thought that believes that we've now hit a historic turning point. 40 years of various trends like globalization, bringing the Chinese labor force into the global economy. That's sort of coming to an end, and we're now faced with 30, 40 years of inflation, but I'm not there yet. Yeah. But I do think 3 to 5 years, surprisingly stubborn inflation, yeah, and therefore much tighter monetary conditions than just about any of us are used to, right? So many of us are of sufficient age to remember, like 1980s, when the 10-year US Treasury bond yielded like 7 or 8 or 9%. Now it's just yielding 4%, and it's double from it was. It yielded as little as like 2% and 1.5%. Now it's like more than double to like 4%. But many of us who are old enough remember a time when it was like 7, 8, or 9%, right? So here's why I think inflation is going to be surprisingly stubborn. First, in the very short term, believe it or not, a lot of the stimulus, the COVID stimulus that was rolled out in 2020, is still in the system 2 years later. Yeah, like a lot of it is still not yet spent. So households, companies, including many of the companies around this table, actually are sitting on huge corporate savings and huge household savings. So, I expect spending to remain surprisingly strong, yeah, especially in the US. It'll probably take another 1 year for the stimulus effect to finally wear off. Yeah, so believe it or not, this is a long buzz from the COVID stimulus party. We haven't yet kicked into the hangover phase from the COVID stimulus of 2020, 2 years later, right? Number one. Number two, a lot of the inflation is going to be self-inflicted by design. And that means it's actually not necessarily negative. Yeah? So, for example, like this, the easiest illustration I can give you is for years now, maybe for like a decade, society has been agitating more and more loudly for the oil and gas companies to drill less oil. Like, stop this polluting, emitting, carbon-intensive oil and gas stuff, right? Like, just give us the money instead. Like, instead of like plowing tens of billions of dollars every year into exploration and drilling and infrastructure, just return the money to shareholders, pay bigger dividends, do share buybacks, right? Like, these assets have no future. These assets are taboo. Like, these assets are sin, right? Guess what? Be careful what you wish for. Well, we're getting exactly what we've been agitating for, which is less capacity, less production, less reserves, right? So even though there's been a lot of demand destruction on oil, right, particularly in China from COVID-0, and seems like oil prices becoming sensitive to interest rates finally as the ultimate sort of cyclical commodity. I think the medium-term outlook is bleak. Yeah, like basically from university endowments to pension funds, like fewer and fewer people want to invest into coal mines, oil and gas companies, unless they're pivoting to renewables and green hydrogen and the like. Yeah, but there's going to be this timing gap from the time that oil production, gas production drops off or levels off, and the continuing rise in demand, and before renewables really come in a big way. Yeah. So, and this is going to be the period of maximum pain, right? Of like sky-high energy prices, because we're not there yet on renewables and hydrogen and energy storage, whatever, but we're already cutting off the oil and gas and all the coal, right? And that's, you know, deliberate. That's, you know, what especially my kids want. That's what your kids want. That's what the young people want, is we want less oil, we want less gas, we want more electric cars, we want more public transport, we want cleaner air, we want more solar panels and windmills and maybe even nuclear, but that all takes time. In the meantime, we're chopping off our own energy supply. Yeah. We're also hitting the limits on food production. We can't cut down any more Amazon, and even if we cut down the rest of the Amazon, right? That's it. You know, that's a limit on soybeans, right? So we're going to have to go to alternative proteins, right? Alternative meats, like lab-grown meats and the like, right? But again, those all will take time. In the meantime, the supply constraints will really start to be felt. Yeah? Now, ironically, if you think about it, this is the flip side of my optimism around growth and income. So I'm actually very optimistic about growth and about rising incomes. I'm just very pessimistic on supply. You know, I don't believe that the public wants us to do more oil drilling, more gas drilling, right? And amazingly, the public is swallowing skyrocketing energy bills. Like during the energy crisis in Europe, support for Ukraine has risen, not decreased. So just as, you know, utility bills and energy prices are starting to hit the European consumers, like contrary to what Vladimir Putin was betting on, like the opposite has happened. Like they've become more determined, right, to help Ukraine win, rather than losing their courage or losing their stamina, right? And I think, you know, the idealism of our young people is just so strong. You know, like they're willing to bite the bullet, they're willing to cut back, they're willing to suffer, right, to save the planet. And that just means, you know, higher prices and demand destruction. Yeah. And I could go on. There's geopolitics, right? The semiconductor bill from Washington, where it's going to cause supply chain disruptions that will increase costs. I'm not saying the bill is wrong, you know, from Washington's perspective, that may well make geopolitical sense, but the economic impact will be higher prices, right? If people are serious, and I believe they are, about reducing dependency on China, that's going to cost a bomb. That's going to be massively expensive, yeah? Because China is unbelievable as a manufacturing powerhouse of the world, right? Nobody, frankly, can beat China on cost. So if, for geopolitical reasons and for domestic security reasons, people diversify away from China, that's going to cost a lot more and lead to much higher prices of goods, well, especially goods, but eventually also services here. Keep in mind that today, China produces 90% of the world's solar panels, 80% of the world's lithium-ion batteries, and 70% of the world's wind turbines. Yeah. China currently produces 90% of Apple's gadgets. Yeah. And so, you know, shifting the supply chain away from China is going to be so costly. You know, get ready for more expensive solar panels, more expensive lithium-ion batteries, more expensive iPhones, more expensive iPads, laptops, and the like. Yeah. So, again, I could go on, but this is just to give you a flavor for why I think this is also like labor force issues, demographic issues. I was quite shocked to read that China's population will shrink by 50% from 1.4 billion to 700 million by 2050 or 2075, depending on how bad it gets, right? So that's a massive loss of workers to the world economy. And can we train up enough Indians, enough Indonesians, enough Filipinos, right, in time to replace this rapid fall-off in Chinese workers in the world economy? Yeah? So things like that. Thank you.
Fantastic. We still have time for a couple of questions. Anybody would like to take one? Yeah, Sudit, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Sachin and Tom. Very, very good perspective. So just wanted to get your perspective on food security and the state of agriculture in Indonesia. I'll just put some thoughts first. So we just crossed 8 billion mark, you know, and food security and affordability is big topic right now on agenda everywhere. Indonesia, other than palm oil, we are almost importing everything, you know, whether we take it corn, wheat, sugar, milk, beef, everything. All other large countries are either self-sufficient or even they're exporting as well. So is agriculture has not been getting enough attention in Indonesia? So wanted to get your perspective, and as you are part of now Pani's team, so what are the policies or any thoughts from that perspective? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Such a fundamental question, food security and agriculture. I would say that agriculture gets plenty of attention, but a minimum of political courage. Yeah. So we talk about it a lot, actually, in cabinet, among policy circles. And I remember discussing with then Economy Coordinating Minister Darmin. Yeah. I think, how does this go? Over 15 years, from 2000 to 2015, the number of Indonesians employed in agriculture fell from like 40% to like 20%. Yeah. So assuming a labor force of, say, 200 million people, right? We've lost like 40 million farmers over 15 years, right? And that percentage is going to keep going down. Yeah. Because of economic growth and urbanization and tremendous growth in the services sector, right? So a lot of young people would prefer to work in a shopping mall or in a tourist resort or even on an airline, than in the field, tilling the fields. That is natural and frankly, nothing unique. That is true all around the world. Given a chance, people would rather not be fishermen. In fact, I remember as trade minister observing, wow, in Bali there's a particular beach where there's a lot of fishermen, and all their kids, rather than continuing to be fishermen, decided to open restaurants and cafes along the beach, right, with fresh seafood barbecue, and their income is like 5 times to 10 times higher than their parents' income, who actually catch the fish. So it's actually barbecuing the fish and serving the fish and, making Instagrammable cafes. And so, yet while this trend is happening, we just don't invest the political capital to, for example, consolidate small plots, right? To basically push smallholders into cooperatives so that small plots can be combined into large plots that can then be prepared for mechanization, right? So one very positive thing would be the political will to actually do these things. Yeah. The other thing that I would highlight here is people often confuse security with non-dependence, or non-interdependence. So people think that if we don't have to import, we're safer. The reality is actually the opposite. When you import less, you'll be less secure. Yeah. And one recent example that I love to give is actually the USA recently had a massive baby formula crisis. Yeah. So the baby formula industry in the US became so concentrated and so protectionist. Basically, the US is self-sufficient in baby formula. Yeah. But basically, there was a production problem at one huge factory that Abbott has somewhere in the Midwest. And it cascaded through their factory system because the consumer protection agencies, regulators descended on Abbott like a dragon, right? Because babies were getting poisoned or there was quality problems or whatever, right? And basically a significant portion of America's baby formula production capacity was lost. And baby formula prices skyrocketed, and there was shortages of baby formula all around the country until they finally imported baby formula from Singapore, right? Now, if the US had had a more diversified supply chain, where in addition to their well-cultivated domestic capacity, they also had several trade channels as a safety buffer, then that crisis would have been overcome very, very quickly, right? And it was eventually overcome through imports, right? So one lesson that we haven't yet socialized around the world, actually, yeah? I think we've all been too busy with Boris Johnson to Liz Truss to Rishi Sunak, Bolsonaro to Lula, now Jokowi, Anies, everything, right? We haven't gotten to the substantive stuff. That's why I lament the relative lack of substance this year and last year, yeah? Domestically and around the world. But we need to explain that actually, if you want better security, we need to lead to greater interdependence, actually. Yes? So actually, becoming less interdependent makes everybody less secure. Yeah. There's other policy tricks and policy tips, on how to ensure food security that I will not share for fear that our political rivals will steal my ideas. So, but actually, you know, there's a lot of very commonsensical policies you can adopt to maintain stable food prices and boost food security. But stay tuned and vote for us.
Okay, some last comments. Maybe Nalin, you have a point to add before we wrap up?
Tom, it's always so refreshing to listen to you. Thank you very much for that. I have a layperson question. In business circles, economic circles, we all know what's coming, and there's near unanimity that there's a big storm coming economically. But in many countries, the political class, and I mean India and Indonesia especially, are hawking a narrative that it won't be so bad here. We will be better off. We are a large consumptive economy. Are they being delusional, or are they trying not to panic us?
In short, I think they're delusional. I gotta say, you know, talk about being forward-looking, right? Like, I wonder what would happen to us if we were in power for 10 years. You know, I'm becoming a bigger and bigger believer in term limits. I think it's just human nature. I don't think it's unique to this regime. You know, you look at examples around the world where their first 7 years were great. And after year 8, year 9, things just completely fell apart, right? And there are certain leaders that I should not name who've been in power for 15, 20 plus years, and it just all falls apart, you know, after a while. So I think that is the magic of democracy, is that automatic renewal, that refresh, you know, like rejuvenation with electoral cycles, right? You bring in the new, and the new is not always better, but at least it's new, you know, at least it's a change. And look, sometimes, you know, that change can last only 2 years, like President Habibie, who is sitting in his library, right? Or President Wahid, right? Or 45 days, like Liz Truss. But at least it's change. You know, at least we're moving. We're going somewhere. We're trying different things, and experiments often fail, right? But you learn from those mistakes and you move on, right? I do worry a lot of people around the world have amassed too much power for too long, right? And I've seen it firsthand. What happens is possibly every system, the sycophants win in the end, unavoidably. Like people like me get crowded out, right? Because given a choice between flattery and adulation, and at best boring technocratic stuff, at worst like painful truths, as a human being, which way will you fall? You know, I'm not sure any of us put in the same situation would do any better, right? So we have to rely on the system, the institutions that Shoeb, you just touched on so importantly, right? To make sure that we move on, right? That there's renewal, there's regeneration. My pitch to President Jokowi was, and to Pak Anies is, that the happiest people in the world are Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. They did a great 2 terms in the White House, and then practically tap danced their way out of the White House. Like, not even a year went by, they signed a $100 million co-production deal with Netflix, right? Not even 2 years went by, they signed another $30 million or something co-production deal with Spotify to produce podcasts. And they're having a blast, right? Remember when they came to Indonesia and visited President Jokowi in Bogor, then went to Bali, and they went like whitewater rafting with the daughters. Like, they're having a blast, right? So I can't understand why anybody would want to be stuck in a presidency or prime ministership forever and forever and forever, right? When they could be out there partying, right? And so, you know, I think the blockbuster tenure is 1 or 2 terms. Do the best you can, work for history, right? As Pak Anies always says, don't worry what they write in media or even social media. Worry about what they will write about you in the history books, because that's forever, right? And then go back to private life, and it's finally time to enjoy, you know? And look at Lula, right? Well, he came to a bit of an ignominious end, but guess what? He came back, right? And so, you know, that's another option, maybe. But allow the market to work. Allow market forces. Allow competitive forces in the electoral system to work, right? To bring in and bring out. Switch in and switch out. I worry that you know, more and more people are delusional, either because they've been there for too long and surrounded by more and more sycophants, or it's a deliberate policy. So this is to your second point. Well, you're putting it in a very benign way, trying not to panic us, right? Many are trying to bamboozle the voters, right? Like the demagogues and populists that I mentioned earlier. But again, I'm cautiously hopeful that the tsunami of populism and spin and you know, demagoguery and you know, normalization of lying in politics is potentially cresting and potentially, you know, retreating, right? But that phrase of the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, right? So we still need to be vigilant, and we still need to safeguard our institutions and safeguard democracy to make sure that that you know, this ebb and flow you know, really happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Patom, and I think we'll close on that. We just about come to end, but Patom will be around. You might have a few minutes with him if you have any off the stage questions. Actually, Patom made a very good point about, you know, believing in term limits, because when you're in power for long enough, you tend to pat yourself on the back and then convince everybody else that the tiger at the door is just a street cat, and that creates a different kind of danger. And it's important that we have these cyclical wake-up calls, which allows us to re-look at the emerging, I would say, economic and political situation, and allow us to re-engineer many things which are sometimes needed. I would say disruption has to come across all sectors, and sometimes disruption is good. So we wish you all the best. Thank you here especially to Lynn Neumann. Lynn from Amcham, thank you for spending your time here. Connie from Eurocham, Shoeb from Singcham, Poonam from the IIBF, and all of you who have joined us today and have stayed back for this extremely entertaining and I would say insightful session. We always have great sessions with you, Patom, and we look forward to continue to doing the same thing in 2023. Thank you very much.